In a lecture hall that you won't find in any university rankings, an old professor stood before his class. His hands, marked with the fine lines of 1,000 turned pages, trembled slightly on the lectern. He was lecturing on the great works of art, trying to explain the soul of a Mozart symphony to a room full of students who were listening at 2x speed. He could see them, bright, efficient, their fingers dancing across keyboards, capturing every key point for the upcoming exam. They were masters of absorption and repetition. They knew everything, but he felt they understood nothing. Then he stopped. He abandoned his notes, looked over the tops of their laptop screens, and asked a question that wasn't on the syllabus. "Tell me," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "when was the last time you said thank you and truly felt it? Not as a reflex, but as an acknowledgement of a gift." The frantic typing suddenly ceased. The silence that filled the room wasn't thoughtful or reflective. It was the hollow, awkward silence of a system that had been presented with an error message, a query for which it had no data. And in that moment, the professor realized he wasn't just teaching a subject. He was witnessing the end of a language. Wow. That scene is just, it's really powerful, isn't it? It captures that clash perfectly. You know, this drive for efficiency, for knowledge you can measure, bumping right up against, well, what it means to actually feel something deeply.
Exactly, that hollow silence he felt. That's what we're diving into today. It's this sense that something vital is getting lost.
Right. We're looking at how this loss of depth, of real connection, is showing up across the board in education, our digital lives, even in how our culture values things.
It feels like we're almost optimizing the humanity right out of our systems. It's not just about individuals being distracted. It seems baked into the structures themselves.
So it's systemic, the way our schools work, the way our online platforms are designed, even our basic economic thinking. They all seem to prioritize what's easy to count over what's, well, intrinsically valuable, but maybe harder to pin down.
Precisely. It's the difference between knowing the map coordinates and actually having explored the territory.
Okay.
We need to unpack how these systems actually work to create that effect.
Okay, so let's start with education, where the system really begins to shape us. I read about this university student in Lyon, a philosophy major. And by all accounts, he was brilliant, a total master of the academic game, especially that really structured French essay style.
Right, the dissertation. Highly formalized.
Exactly. So he could spend weeks just memorizing and breaking down really complex thinkers like Foucault or Derrida, knew all the arguments, the critiques, perfect for the exam.
He was tuned perfectly for that system, knew exactly how to succeed within those rules.
But then the curveball came from his grandmother. Night before a big exam, she sees him stressed out. She only had basic schooling, right? And she asks him this incredibly simple human question.
Yeah.
She says, all these smart people you read, what did they think makes a person good? And what do you think makes a person good?
Oh, wow. That hits different than an exam question.
Totally. And it just stopped him in his tracks. He had all this complex theory in his head, but for that question, nothing. He realized he was a fantastic information processor.
But maybe not a thinker in that deeper sense.
Exactly. And that really points the finger at the modern education system, doesn't it? It's become super effective at creating specialists, people fluent in the jargon of their field.
They know the language.
But they can be strangers to its soul, you know? To the ethical core, the why behind it all. The system rewards the right answer on the test.
But forgets about sparking that genuine personal understanding or moral reflection.
Yeah.
It rewards the output, not necessarily the internal process.
So if the system is geared towards rewarding that kind of processing, what's driving student behavior? Is it that education itself feels more like a transaction now rather than, I don't know, personal formation?
I think that's a huge part of it. You've got these two kinds of motivation, right? There's intrinsic motivation, that's curiosity, genuine interest, the joy of figuring something out that's linked to deep learning.
Right, learning because you want to.
Yeah. And then there's extrinsic motivation grades, passing the assessment, getting the degree for the job. That's tied more to surface learning.
Getting through it.
And while educators obviously want that deep intrinsic stuff, the system itself, especially in higher ed, leans really heavily on extrinsic motivators to get students engaged. The research is pretty clear. Students might resist the course material, but they will pay attention to the assessment because that's what determines the outcome for them.
Makes sense. If you're focused on getting the credential, you focus on the hoops you have to jump through, the tests.
Precisely. And this creates what's called the backwash effect of assessment. Students basically use the exam or the rubric as their main guide for what they need to learn.
So they reverse engineer their learning from the test.
Pretty much. And here's the tricky part. Deep learning takes time. If you want to use active learning methods like group problem solving or complex projects, you often have to reduce the sheer amount of information you cover.
Ah, so there's a trade-off. Deeper learning on less material versus broader coverage tested superficially.
Exactly. Because you can't easily test a huge breadth of knowledge and deep application at the same time, not efficiently anyway. So the system often defaults to testing recall of a narrower set of facts.
Which incentivizes students to just focus on that guaranteed exam content rather than exploring related ideas or reading beyond the syllabus. It's an efficiency calculation for them.
It's purely strategic. What's the minimum I need to do to get the grade? That often means skipping optional lectures, not doing extra reading, not making those wider connections.
All the stuff that actually builds that broader critical thinking his grandmother was asking about.
Right. The focus becomes reproduction, memory, not synthesis or original thought.
And this focus on measurable output makes the whole system vulnerable to big top-down changes like those Bologna reforms in Europe you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the Bologna process. Huge initiative. Started back in '99. It aimed to create this common European higher education area, make degrees comparable, transparent, more student-centered.
And structurally, it seemed like a big success, right? Most places adopted the bachelor-master system quickly, put in quality assurance.
The framework went up fast, yeah. 83% adoption is huge. But the deeper goals, like really using learning outcomes to drive curriculum change and foster genuine student-centered learning, that often fell short.
Why did the student-centered part stumble, if that was the vision?
Well, a big reason was lack of investment. Real student-centered teaching needs smaller classes, better student-staff ratios, more training for instructors.
Which costs money.
A lot of money. And most countries didn't really pony up. So instead, many institutions just did a kind of superficial restructure. They took their old, longer degree programs and just crammed the content into the new, shorter bachelor's degrees.
Whoa. So students end up with less time for independent work, less time to think, less time for the very mobility and flexibility Bologna was supposed to enable.
That's exactly what often happened. Curricular cramming, more required courses, less space for exploration. Yeah. And that whole defining learning outcomes thing, it was supposed to be this moment of deep thought about why we teach what we teach.
Right.
But often it just became a box-ticking exercise. Bureaucracy over purpose. Let's just get the paperwork done to comply, rather than fundamentally rethinking teaching.
And this connects to leadership challenges too, doesn't it? If the structural changes happen fast, why didn't the pedagogical changes keep pace?
Well, making those deep changes requires strong leadership within universities, people willing to push against old habits. But here's the rub. Around the same time, many universities were also undergoing governance reforms.
Okay.
These reforms often increase the power of central management, sometimes quite significantly. So faculty members were seeing these Bologna changes pushed on them. At the same time, they felt their own autonomy and academic freedom were being squeezed by new management structures.
Ah, so they saw it all as one big package of top-down control.
In many cases, yes. They became suspicious. The leaders needed to champion deep pedagogical change, were often seen as authoritarian figures pushing a bureaucratic agenda. So you got resistance.
And where there was resistance, the reforms stayed superficial. Just changing labels, not the actual experience.
Pretty much. It ended up reinforcing that culture of surface learning and just doing enough to comply. It shows that just rearranging the structure doesn't automatically lead to deeper learning if the underlying incentives and trust aren't there. The focus stayed on processing students efficiently.
Okay, so from the classroom compliance culture, let's jump to the screen compliance culture. It feels like a similar dynamic plays out online performing value instead of embodying it. There was this story about a young graphic designer. Mm-hmm. She was, quite rightly, really upset about a local library potentially closing. So she launched this online campaign. Slick video, great hashtag, save our shelves.
Sounds like a modern activism success story.
Totally. It went viral, tens of thousands of followers, tweets flooding the city council. She felt like she was really making waves.
That dopamine hit of online engagement, likes, shares.
Exactly. But then the day came for the actual council meeting where the decision was being made. And the public gallery. Almost empty.
Oof.
Yeah. A few older residents showed up in person, but that huge online army, nowhere to be seen. The council voted to close the library, basically saying there wasn't enough physical community support shown.
That highlights the paradox perfectly. Massive reach online, but it translates into very little real-world action or presence.
Yeah.
Social media gives you the feeling of having participated.
Right. The satisfaction.
Without actually requiring the hard work, the time, the investment of showing up physically. It almost like commodifies your good intentions into these little clicks and shares. So you get the reward without doing the real work.
And if we're doing that kind of performative stuff repeatedly, what does that do to us psychologically? That constant kind of low-level disengaged engagement.
The impact is pretty significant. It starts with the sheer volume of information. We're constantly bombarded with news, often tragic news, from everywhere, all the time. Our brains just aren't wired for that.
It leads to overload.
Definitely. It leads to desensitization. Our emotional responses get dulled. This is what people call compassion fatigue. You just get emotionally exhausted. You run out of the capacity to genuinely care about another crisis.
So it's not just fatigue, it's almost like a defense mechanism kicks in, leading to what you called compassion collapse.
It's both, really. The fatigue triggers the defense. Compassion collapse is when, as the number of things demanding our empathy goes up, our ability to connect deeply with any one person or cause goes down. We start treating suffering almost like a spectacle to scroll past.
And the language we use online reflects that too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about things like womp womp, the incredibly dismissive sound used to trivialize someone's problem, or just shutting down a conversation with didn't ask.
Yeah, that feels very final, very distancing.
It is. It's the language of emotional distance, of self-protection. Suffering becomes something to observe, maybe comment on, but rarely something that actually mobilizes us. Thinkers like Oliver Sacks warned about this excessive digital life leading to superficial connections, a kind of manufactured isolation where real face-to-face interactions start to feel awkward, even paralyzing.
And that isolation isn't just psychological, it has huge social effects too. These platforms promise connection, but often they seem to just amplify individualism and class divisions.
They really do. Instead of building solidarity, they often become stages for individual performance and status display.
Right. Showing off your perfect life or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you get these starkly separate worlds reflected on our screens. On one hand, the elite showing off luxury, gated communities, fancy holidays. And on the other hand, the majority may be complaining, asking for help, expressing outrage. It creates this digital alienation, widening the gap between different people's realities and expectations.
That example from Egypt really illustrated that the way inequality itself gets marketed. You see ads for luxury compounds selling isolation as a desirable feature.
Seclusion as a status symbol.
Yeah. And right next to it, maybe a charity ad using really stark images of poverty just to get a quick emotional reaction, a fleeting bit of pity.
But never really prompting a deeper look at why that inequality exists. It's just accepted as part of the background noise. And that normalization is dangerous. It kills the potential for collective action.
So instead of organizing together, we just have these individual momentary reactions online that disappear as fast as they arrive, like that library campaign.
Exactly. And the political result is powerlessness. It fosters a mindset where people can't easily connect their own struggles to bigger economic structures. Social bonds weaken, and political action gets reduced to just noise, lots of shouting, but no collective force.
Which just feeds back into the cycle, right? Feeling powerless leads to retreating inward, focusing only on yourself.
Or, if you feel successful in that digital or material world, maybe justifying your separation from others. Either way, the potential for real community breaks down, and the sense of shared value just evaporates.
Okay, so this pattern efficiency over depth, measurable output over soul, I run through education, through our digital lives, and that brings us to the really big structural issue. This fundamental crisis in what we even consider valuable. Think about that software architect story. The guy whose life was perfectly optimized, elegant code, quantifiable results, everything managed. Successful, but
Quietly bored.
empty, right? Living by the metrics, but missing something essential. And then he has this encounter in an art gallery, standing in front of that Caspar David Friedrich painting, Monk by the Sea.
Ah, yes. Powerful image. Just vastness, solitude.
And there's nothing to optimize there, no problem to solve, no data points. He just feels awe, melancholy, this sense of being small but connected to something huge, emotions that don't fit on a spreadsheet.
It gave him better questions, not easy answers. And that perfectly illustrates the problem with how modern economics thinks about value.
It just doesn't compute things like awe.
Pretty much. Modern economics, going back to the Enlightenment really, it prioritizes the rational economic actor, someone focused on profit, on production. Value is measured by quantity, by price. If it doesn't have a price tag.
It doesn't count. Or worse, it's seen as a cost.
Exactly. So vital things, arts, culture, caregiving, real education that fosters deep thinking, they get sidelined or misvalued because they don't easily generate profit in that narrow sense. They're seen as expenses on the national budget.
Look at GDP, right? Gross domestic product. It's meant to measure economic health, but it leaves out anything that isn't bought or sold.
The classic example always gets me. Breastfeeding versus beer drinking. Both might be categorized under leisure in some frameworks.
Right.
But drinking beer generates tax revenue. It contributes to GDP. Breastfeeding, essential as it is, doesn't have that direct monetary transaction, so it's invisible in the calculation.
That's absurd when you think about the actual human value involved.
It shows a fundamental flaw in how we measure what matters. If the economy only sees value when money changes hands, what about all the unpaid work that holds society together? Volunteering, community building, caring for family.
It's like hiring a nanny adds to GDP, but a parent doing the exact same care work doesn't count. The value only appears when it becomes a transaction.
That's the logic. And because that's the dominant logic, people advising on culture or care are always going to be pushed aside in government by the finance advisors. It doesn't matter if the government is left or right. The underlying economic model sees these things as costs to be managed, not investments in well-being.
And this external pressure, this economic devaluation, is actually made worse by an internal crisis happening within the humanities themselves, isn't it? They seem to be having their own identity crisis.
That's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
There's this deep conflict within higher education humanities departments about their fundamental purpose, rooted in clashing worldviews.
Okay, what are the two views?
Well, you have the traditional, you could call it mimetic view. This assumed the world had some kind of intrinsic order, maybe even universal truths or concept of the good. The goal of humanities was formation, using logic, history, rhetoric to help people understand that order and live well within it. Think classical education aiming for wisdom.
Okay, seeking truth outside oneself.
Right. Then you have the more dominant view today, often linked to postmodernism, which you could call poetic. This view tends to assume the world is fundamentally chaotic or socially constructed. There's no objective universal truth out there. Truth is basically the subjective experience of the individual. Man is the measure of all things, as the old saying goes.
So truth is internal, personal experience.
Largely, yes. And if that's your starting point, the goal of education shifts dramatically. The traditional tools, logic, structured argument, analyzing historical texts for objective meaning, they start to look suspicious.
Why suspicious?
Because logic suggests there are external standards for truth, right? That some arguments are valid and others aren't universally. That clashes with the idea that subjective experience is the ultimate arbiter. So, structure and discipline can be seen as just tools of power, ways to police individual identity or enforce conformity.
So the classroom changes from a place where you learn disciplines to analyze the world.
To more of a stage for students to express their personal feelings and experiences. The teacher's role shifts towards validating those feelings, almost like a therapist, rather than challenging students with rigorous intellectual standards.
And there are real psychological consequences to that shift.
Well, some argue yes. If you constantly train people to look inward, to interpret everything through the lens of their own feelings and identity, it can create a kind of self-referential loop. It might be linked, some studies suggest, to rising rates of anxiety and neuroticism, because individuals lack robust frameworks for engaging with a challenging, objective, external world.
That creates a tough choice for students then. Go into humanities departments that might deny objective reality and foster that inward focus.
Leading towards solipsism, yeah.
Or go into STEM fields that often dismiss subjective experience entirely, focusing only on the measurable.
Scientism. Right. There seems to be this missing middle ground in the university, a way to integrate both objective analysis and subjective human experience, leaving students without a really broad vision of, what it means to be human or what truly matters.
And this whole value crisis plays out directly in political decisions about funding the arts and culture, doesn't it? They seem like the first things on the chopping block.
Absolutely. When times get tough economically or politics get volatile, the arts are incredibly vulnerable. We've seen it clearly.
Like in Berlin, right? Huge cultural hub, but a change in government led to a 13% cut in the cultural budget.
And it wasn't based on some strategic review of culture's value. It was driven by finance ministries, seeing it as an easy place to save money. Just a line item to be cut.
And the UK example shows a longer trend. Years of austerity hit arts institutions hard, and that whole creative industries push.
It started with good intentions, linking culture to social benefit. But over time, it got narrowed down purely to economic impact, boosting exports, attracting tourists. The intrinsic value, the social value, got lost. Art is only valued if it makes money for UK PLC.
And then there are even more direct threats, like potential censorship, that Arts Council England guidance telling funded groups to avoid being overtly political.
Yeah, that sent a real chill through the sector. It was widely seen as pressure, particularly around sensitive issues like support for Palestine. It shows how quickly political agendas can try to silence critical voices or complex perspectives when culture is already devalued and seen as dependent rather than essential.
Okay, so pulling these threads together, education rewarding surface learning, digital life promoting performative empathy, and economics ignoring intrinsic worth.
It all points to the same problem, doesn't it? We've prioritized the measurable, the efficient, the transactional.
Over the deep, the human, the reflective. We've let the metrics replace the meaning. So the big challenge is, how do we push back? How do we reclaim a language of value that includes the soul, not just the spreadsheet?
The core strategy has to be redefining value itself. Moving away from this narrow focus on profit and GDP and towards valuing what some call reproduction, everything we do to keep people healthy, happy, connected, cared for, capable of living good lives.
That includes arts, culture, care, education, all the things currently seen as costs.
Exactly. And a crucial part of this is fighting that constant narrative of scarcity. The idea that we can't afford arts and healthcare and education.
Right. Pitting essential things against each other.
When the reality, certainly in wealthy parts of the world, isn't a lack of resources, it's how we distribute them and what we choose to value. So redefining value means challenging that scarcity myth head on.
Okay, so that's the philosophical shift. But what about concrete actions? How can people working in culture, for instance, actually make this case effectively to policymakers?
Well, one key strategy is about reframing the language. Stop just talking about culture's historical importance and start using narratives policymakers understand. Focus on transformation and public good, ideally in ways that can be, ironically, measured.
Like that social prescribing example in the UK.
Exactly. That's a brilliant piece of reframing. By showing that engaging with arts and culture, visiting museums, joining choirs can demonstrably improve people's health and well-being, you link culture directly to a high-priority area like healthcare.
So art stops being just a nice-to-have and becomes part of the solution to costly problems like loneliness or mental health issues.
Precisely. It gives culture real political leverage because it speaks the language of outcomes and cost-effectiveness, even while delivering intrinsic benefits.
Which leads to the next strategy, building coalitions, right? Connecting arts with other undervalued sectors.
Absolutely essential. Arts need to forge strong alliances with healthcare, education, environmental groups, all the sectors that struggle under the same narrow economic model that fails to see their true value.
Strength in shared marginalization.
You got it. Stop fighting over scraps of the budget amongst yourselves and present a united front, arguing for a broader definition of public good. Network constantly outside your own silo.
And finally, how do you make this sustainable? Avoid burnout. Keep the pressure on even when politics change.
That requires thinking about permanent advocacy, building structures like rotational leadership or shared documentation systems so that knowledge isn't lost and people don't burn out after one campaign, institutionalizing the lobbying effort.
And keeping the public involved.
Critically important. Supporting grassroots platforms, ensuring cultural and civic conversations happen out in the open, not just behind closed doors. The biggest danger isn't necessarily one political party or another. It's an empty public square where these values aren't even discussed anymore. We have to insist on speaking this language of deeper value constantly. Ultimately, it comes back to that professor's realization and the software architect facing the sea. Arts, culture, the humanities. They aren't luxuries. They're how societies reflect, heal, care for each other, and imagine better ways to live. Finding real meaning isn't about chasing the next efficiency gain. It's about reclaiming our capacity for that deep reflection, for awe, for genuinely acknowledging the value in just being together. That's the language we risk losing, and the one we urgently need to rediscover.